Right, good morning, everybody. This is Bob, and it's the Highway podcast. And I have an unusual situation this morning, unusual guests. Unusual in the sense that we've got two people on the podcast, one whom you already know if you watch the podcast, which is Heiko from Germany. And then I've got, I don't know whether I can call him a friend or not, Heiko. He's become, I feel like I've known you for years, Zane, but we've only known each other. We've only known each other a short period of time. Now, I want to have a chat with you, Zane, about your martial arts background and what you do. And my main interest, as is Heiko's, is you're very involved with the wrestling game. That's true, isn't it?
It is indeed.
And how long have you been into that?
Well, I've been into wrestling my whole life, but I started with judo when I was really small.
Right.
Never actually realised it was wrestling until I was a lot older. But it's basically just Japanese jacket wrestling. So I've always done the judo, and then through that, obviously I did a bit of BJJ when that first started coming over, end of the 90s, and moved into freestyle wrestling and eventually into the traditional wrestling. And yeah, it was quite.
Do you have a preference?
Yes, now my preference is entirely for traditional wrestlings.
Right.
And and I'm quite surprised that it's such a small niche kind of area. I'm surprised that they've disappeared to such an extent. And one of the things that fascinates me is how I can grow up learning Japanese wrestling in the middle of the Welsh hills, and the traditional wrestling from that area has disappeared to such an extent that we didn't even know it existed, let alone that it existed and it died out. And I find that really interesting. Especially,
it's funny, isn't it? It's funny that, and it's like my journey started off with Oriental martial arts as well, and now as I get older, I'm getting more and more interested in the indigenous arts of Europe. You know what I mean? Because we had a massive tradition of martial training, and in many respects, personally, I think a lot more effective.
Yeah, well, it clearly was. I mean, you don't hear any stories from the colonial days about how guys got absolutely massacred when they were coming up against people that had skills they couldn't cope with, or, you know, the sailors using their basic cutlass skills when they were running into people over there. There was nothing that was intimidating or made them think twice. And that's really interesting. So how this backfeed came, that they were amazing warriors. Like the Japanese are a particularly interesting group because everybody thinks it's such an amazing warrior culture, but they lost every battle they fought against anybody who wasn't Japanese.
Yeah.
So they lost in Korea, they lost against the Chinese, they lost against the Mongols, but they have this incredible martial culture that's mostly built up between fighting amongst themselves. And although there was without a doubt people who were incredibly skillful there, why did it persist there and have such a strong incentive about it that it backfed to us, whereas our arts, which were at least as functional, if not more functional, they just disappear. And you know, we're not talking about long ago. You know, like when my granddad was a boy, they were still teaching swordwork in parts of the army and the navy. Yet now, it's as if it never happened, and people are surprised and still think it's amazing when you see a Japanese sword. So it's a really interesting question.
It's funny because I was in the Cubs and the Scouts in the 60s, obviously, when I was a young lad.
Oh, yeah.
And you could get a badge for stick fighting.
Yeah, see, that's amazing. See, I had no idea that we had a whole history of stick fighting. And
I miss that.
Yeah, it's incredible. And like now, like Heiko's seen the photo, the old photo from the Bedfordshire Highland Games when the Highland regiments
right.
in Bedford waiting to, they were sent initially to Bedford because they were expecting the possibility of a German invasion, and they weren't sure where it was going to come, so they sent them to the south coast so that they could go quickly to the east or to the south, and they waited there before they were deployed over the channel to the Somme. And once I saw that photo, and you start looking into it, and you're like, well, and I live in Paisley, and one of the great sword fighters of Scottish history came from Paisley, and it turns out that our museum's got this enormous collection of swords that they just put in the basement because they didn't think anybody would be interested in them, and it's just so interesting how that changes between the two cultures. And what is it? What is it about judo that enabled it not only to thrive and spread across the whole world, and even made it to my little tiny Welsh village, where the traditional Welsh wrestling, even though the language survived, even though the Eisteddfod had survived, a lot of all the Celtic countries, a lot of the culture survived in Wales, but the wrestling just totally disappeared. Whereas down in Brittany, they kept the wrestling, but they lost their Eisteddfod. So,
I think it's the lure of the exotic, isn't it? You know, it's like, well, it's different, so therefore. And I remember people used to say to me, you know, oh yeah, you know, the Japanese, the Oriental martial arts are so much better. And I never, as a small lad of like 11, 12-year-old, I wasn't going to question it, was I? You know, but I remember the badge for stick fighting in the Scouts. You know what I mean? It was like,
see, that's amazing. That's amazing.
You know, I mean, how come I didn't sort of, because I obviously interested in martial arts and fighting and wrestling and stuff like that as a kid. I think a lot of lads, certainly my generation, were always into wrestling, because I used to wrestle with my brother, you know. And my dad used to sort of referee, because we used to watch it on the telly. You know, the professional wrestling.
But this is the bizarre
people like that, you know. But obviously, but then of course, and I'd started doing a bit of boxing, but I went to karate with my mate because it was better, you know. And yet it wasn't. It wasn't. You know, we spent the best part of 3 years just walking up and down in lines, punching fresh air, you know.
I never even thought of boxing as a martial art.
No, neither did I.
Boxing was just something you did, and it was, you know, young boys, you play rugby, you do boxing, that's it.
Yeah.
No, it's not a martial art. Martial art was judo or karate or And I remember when first saw Thai boxing when I was like, what, 17? I just loved it. It was just amazing. I was so fascinated by it.
It was about 5 years ago then, was it?
I think the main thing is that that our generations are very much influenced by movies, and I mean from the 70s until today, Asian martial arts are of course very represented in movies, and I think the Hong Kong kung fu movies and also many later American productions, they made it into, you know, all over the world, and I think that promoted Eastern martial arts a lot in the last you know, since the 1950s, 1960s, starting with people like Bruce Lee. I think that's one reason also that why people, and of course more artistic, if someone does you know, a spinning backflip, turning high kick, flying through the air, it looks much more spectacular than when someone just knocks someone out with one punch, and, you know, with a fist or something like that. So
there's something a lot deeper to it than that, though, because like we're quite unusual in judo because we actually have 4 generations of judoka in our family. So given that it hasn't been in Britain that long, I don't imagine there's too many families that are on the 4th generation now. But my grandfather, he got his black belt from the Budokai in London, which was the first public club in Britain. There were private clubs before that at the universities of Cambridge and Oxford, but he was a working class lad who got his black belt from there in the 1930s. And why was he going to learn judo all the way back then? You know, he was a tough lad. Like he was from Lavender Hill, where you know, they've obviously made the films about the Lavender Hill mob and that. And you know, So why did he go and learn judo? Like, he had some of the toughest boxing clubs around by him. It was still an era where a lot of the British martial arts was still very much alive.
Yeah.
And you look before that as well, like London that time was still a really pretty rough place to be. And you see with all the Bartitsu stuff, where even where London was still really, really rough, you had groups of people who were bringing in the European, the Asian martial arts and mixing them in with the British martial arts. Yeah, so it's
I
really
think it's
interesting.
the thrill of, isn't it the thrill of the exotic? I mean, when I started karate, there was only one karate club in the whole town, you know. There was one in Sunderland, which was like 7 or 8 miles away, and there was one in South Shields. And then the movies came out, as you said, Heiko. The Bruce Lee thing happened in 72 or whatever. I think it was 72, 73. And I remember the club just being packed, just absolutely rammed. And my karate teacher hated it, you know. But I've spoken to whole generations of students who their influence was the movies. I didn't have that influence. It was weird. It was just a pal of mine said there's this karate club thing opening up in the town. And we found a book in the local library called Teach Yourself Karate by Eric Dominy, which is like a really old teach yourself book, the yellow and black ones, which you might remember, Zane. I don't know.
I've still got a few.
Yeah. And I looked at it, little drawings, and me and my mate were copying them. We were about 10 or 11 years old. And then we went down to this club, and it was really austere. It was really tough. You know, there was only about 6 kids, and Danny Shiganis, or Sensei as we used to call him, used to just shout at us. He was a crane driver in the shipyards. And again, you made the point, you know, Danny was a tough guy. He didn't need karate, but he chose to go to Japan and train with Suzuki and then come back and teach to lads in South Shields. But he was still a crane driver, you know, hard as nails, like. And when you look back on it, you think, did Danny Shiganis actually need karate? Probably not. And he didn't do it for money. He wasn't doing it for money. He was like the old school, you know, where if you couldn't pay, he'd just say, "Oh, just pay me next week, son." You know.
But what you said, Bob, especially in the 19th century with colonialism, and there came within the higher classes of the citizens, there became very much an interest what was called Orientalism. So they were all very fascinated because for a wider audience, the world opened up not only through books but also for the better suited classes who could travel and who would bring stories back from there. And as Zane mentioned, Bartitsu being a very good example of how this Oriental stuff mixed with the Western still existing stuff, which was still seen at the time of Barton Wright as a proper way to defend yourself, kind of scientific amateur boxing. I think that is also in this area a reason why it spread. And then, of course, we saw in the story of Barton Wright how the Japanese jiu-jitsu guys or judo guys he brought over took over, and the people were more interested in this one part of his Bartitsu system because it was exotic, and also because these guys were more successful. I mean, Tommy Joe Moore already told a lot about this on your podcast. So if people want to dive deeper into that his story, but this is one thing connecting with that. And then, of course, because you were talking about your first karate school, that came in mind. I think, as Zane said, many people were not thinking about boxing or wrestling really as a combat form, as a martial art, but as a sport. And I think at the time when an impact came of Eastern martial arts, these were considered to be real fighting arts, not for sport. You know what I mean? So people were saying, boxing, but boxing is a sport and wrestling is a sport. And this judo, these locks and breaking bones and whatnot, and karate, punching heads in with bare fists. This is not sports. This is real fighting. This is real martial art for the real world. I think this might also have one of the many influences why it worked like that. And I mean, movies can have a great impact because when you see one of the latest examples, the Lord of the Ring movies, gave a big push into the HEMA community. So many people joined because of this movie, because they were depicting, it was a fantasy movie, but they were depicting fantasy swords basing on real longsword design.
Yeah.
And the same is still true. We had, when I was doing Kendo back then, there came the Kill Bill movies and the Last Samurai movies.
Yeah.
And at this time, we made a little promotion in the cinemas, and then we started a beginner's course. And many people joined because the people had a short rush of craziness about all katana and samurai things, just because the movies put it together in such entertaining fashion. And of course, from 20 people joining,
But that's what's really interesting as well, is because when the love of the Orientalism came over, you still had, I mean, dueling was still happening.
Yeah.
Reading just yesterday, found a thing about a duel between two poets that happened in 1929 in Italy. And one poet had criticised the other guy's poems, and he was like, right, we're dueling to first blood. And they've got the photo of them both in this guy's garden, set into it with swords. And, so the knowledge was all still there, but something sucked them away from that. Like, so you had the very, very real side of it. And that's kind of what's most interesting about the traditional wrestling styles as well, is initially coming from a sport wrestling background, I was always a bit disappointed with the traditional arts. I wasn't really too keen on doing them because the traditional wrestlings, they almost universally have no groundwork in them. And they have no groundwork in them because they're based in real world combat. So they're a sport, but they are supposed to be the first stage of an armed combat system. And as soon as there's arms involved, then as soon as you think somebody's got a knife, then you can forget BJJ. It's just not going to help you. You pull guard on somebody with a knife and you're dead. You may as well just present yourself to, you're finished.
Yeah.
But there's all this kind of fantasy about what's real combat and what's not. And the strange thing is that we had our arts that were designed for real combat, and London was so rough. The first, I keep saying London, it's like the whole country, but we know a lot more about London because a lot more was recorded there. But the first piece of protective gear that was issued to the Metropolitan Police, who were the first police force in Britain, were leather neck straps. So many of them were getting garroted. Right? They used to carry the slap gloves, which had the lead plates in the palm of the hand, so that they would just go around knocking people out. And these aren't the sort of places. That all speaks of real combat, not as in standing toe to toe and having a fair go of it.
No.
These people are trying to kill you, and they're going to get you any way they can. Yet into that, you have this kind of fantasy idea of martial arts that comes in and sits on top of that, and that gains dominance. And then you have a really, really weird thing where you get kind of the fantasy comes in, sits on top, dominates the real arts, and then all of a sudden people start trying to search back for real fighting, and it starts going the other way. But then it's all the more real Eastern arts that are taking over.
And it's funny because that same process has happened with sort of self-protection, combative sort of training, where good self-protection is very, very simple and requires more mindset than it does technical excellence. I remember fighting as a young karate lad against a mate of mine who was a boxer, and he took my head off. And I was a black belt in karate, and my mate who's a boxer, 6 months training, boom, took my head off. And the same things happen with this combatives. The self-protection industry has become marketed now so that in order to keep students, you have to create more techniques and add more to it. Whereas, to my mind, less is much better. It's the same, Heiko knows more about it than I do, certainly with regard to sword. You keep it simple. There's nothing fancy about sword. It's very straightforward.
That's right.
It's basic. You've got to teach men to do it in a very short space of time. So you teach them these cuts, and the parries are very similar to the cuts. And you go, brilliant. And cribby cribongs like that, you've got 7, 8 cuts and a couple of stabs, and then the parries for them are very similar as well. And that was because you needed to teach people to be able to fight on the battlefield quickly. And this what is it? I guess they've just tried to make it bigger than it actually is, you know, so you get more students. I think what drives it is this desire to get more students in, to make more money. I mean, I might be completely wrong. Let's make it as spectacular as possible.
Former instructor of mine, he was very much also he was a wrestler, and he was also into combatives and things like that, but also the Filipino martial arts. And he said also the Filipino martial arts evolved from a simple effective system into selling the martial arts to make a living, which you can no one blame for, but therefore you got all these very fancy techniques evolving, and then also the sport combat aspect. And if you see, for example, Highland broadsword, when you use the material in 1-against-1 sparring, you already can use only very few techniques, because always the same techniques work quite well, and you need 30% of what is inside the manuals we are using. And sometimes you use, again, other 30% stuff, but much more, not so often. And then there are fancy techniques you would never use, or maybe once in a lifetime, but you would not risk your life in a duel, not speaking of a battlefield situation. And if you reduce now from a friendly sparring 1-against-1 and say, okay, I use 30 to 40% of the stuff which is in the manuals, then you can imagine that on the battlefield, you would maybe use like 5 or 10% or 20% tops, you know. So systems don't have to be complicated to work in an environment of a battlefield or self-defense. And even in a duel situation, you rely to the things you know that work and don't have any high risk, because it's about sharp blades and probably your life.
And that's maybe one of the reasons the Eastern arts took over, is because it's the same with the wrestling. Like, the traditional wrestlings are so simple, so very effective, but like the whole kind of Western martial thrust seemed to have been, how can we train somebody to be a capable fighter in 30 days, right? So that we can train 300-400 guys in 30 days so that they can give a good account of themselves. Whereas the Eastern martial arts seem to be all about getting one person into a Superman. Train, and you yourself will become invincible, rather than your squad of 30 men will become very difficult to deal with.
The Japanese have got a funny approach, because the Japanese spend a lot of time on television. You know, you can tell just the art, everything has to be precise and perfect, and that obviously has great repercussions, you know, for technology and things like that, because it means you really focus on things. But I remember there was a guy who was telling me, it was a karate instructor actually, he was telling me when he was living in Japan, he said he saw this guy on TV who was a golf instructor, a baseball teacher from America, and he was teaching the Japanese to play baseball. And the Japanese, and this American was saying, the Japanese are more concerned about where the bat is held, how the shoulders follow through, where the actual movement goes. They were looking at form rather than just, he said, no, man, just hit the fucking ball.
And that's really interesting you say that, because that was the biggest problem I had to overcome moving from judo to freestyle wrestling.
I was going to ask you about that. That's why
that is exactly what it was about. Like, I'll never forget it. Like, went down, and we had a absolutely amazing Russian coach. Like, he was absolutely amazing, and he's like, right, okay, you can start wrestling, come down, right? Went down, and he was like, right, okay, go on then, wrestle. I was like, well, I don't know any wrestling. Right? He says, well, yeah, just start wrestling, and then I'll tell you how to do it better, and you'll learn that way, right? Whereas like the judo, right? Okay, stand like this, take hold of the jacket there, take your other hand there, now step forward just with this foot, turn slightly to the left, and everything's baby stepped through, right? So you're told exactly what to do. Whereas the wrestling's, as you're saying, get it done, just do it. Grab hold of him and put his shoulders on the floor. But I actually became a much better fighter when I started doing the wrestling, because I was over intellectualizing combat.
Yeah.
So when I was doing the judo, I was constantly thinking, "Oh, where are my feet? Where are my feet?" Instead of just smash him. Don't think, just smash him.
Yeah.
Right? And when so yeah, it's an interesting contrast.
I mean, technique's important, but it's like I always try and teach my lads, look, it's the attitude to your training that's the key. You know, keep relaxed, just stay focused. I'm going to teach you a couple of techniques, and let's start sparring with it. You know, that's how I learned Eskrima back in the day, late 70s, early 80s. The first guy who taught me Eskrima, Steve Powell. I mean, he just said, right, hold the stick. This is calling it.
Yes, right? Don't get hit in the head.
No, seriously, he went, this is calling number one. So I went like that. And he went, yeah, he didn't sort of adjust my form or anything because I'd already been doing karate. So I think he was fairly happy. I went like that and he smashed me on the hand, right, with his. And I was like, I went, oh, yeah. And I'm like, oh, what are you doing? And he was like, right, son, pick the stick up. And I was like, oh, he said, pick it up. I picked it up and he went, good lad, good lad. Right, this is a number two. So I did a number two and he smashed the inside of me. And then the third time I picked it up, he went, you'll do all right. He said most people give up after the first one. And it was all about keeping it really simple. And then I noticed exactly what Heiko said. Eskrima became a lot more than it ever was intended. It was just basic little angles, like sword, basic angles to block and to defend and attack. And to be honest, all the Eskrima people I ever spoke to when I used to write for Combat Magazine, the old school guys, some of the Filipinos, they'd say, you'd hear one crack and then one man would go down. That'd be it.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be.
And it also depends on the style you're training, because there are still styles in Eskrima which are quite straightforward to the target. And I think Corto Mano Eskrima, and I think also Lameco style, and also I forget his name. Though there are some styles which are not so overly fancy and working more straightforward. But to about the Japanese, we have to keep in mind, without going too deep in the topic, with the Japanese, we have to keep in mind that many of the things about technique and philosophy and so on evolved in the 300 years. They had no war at all. They had a lot of time to overthink martial arts as an art form, because before that, in the 16th, and a lot of bored warriors in a warrior class which don't have any wars to fight, more like duels and things like that. And before that, I think in the 16th and early 17th century, where during the Sengoku Jidai, when the great civil wars happened, and they had a lot of influence also through the Portuguese, with using firearms and even making them better than the Portuguese who imported them, because they were able to create the Japanese arquebus to be more resistant against the wet climate in Japan. And in this time, they were much more pragmatic in the way they did war. And at that point, if they wouldn't have closed their nation against outside influence, they would, from there, they would just influence, I think, they would just evolve similar in warfare like the Europeans. So going the very pragmatic way and not keeping everything so very, very traditional.
Not like us, Heiko.
But we have to keep in mind that.
Well, of course, Europe was Europe's been in a state of war constantly during that period, wasn't it? I mean, we were, all of the European nations were expanding their empires, weren't they? And practicing their arts on foreign countries, invading them and especially in the 18th and also part of the 19th century, war was just another form of politics. So it was not it was just about power, the power shifting in Europe. It was not about nationalism so much. It was more about you like a chess game. You don't want to do what I want to do, so I invite this. Oh, this throne is open. So I have the true heir for this throne, so I send my army. So it was just, as said, like I think it was a German general who said it, something like that. It is just the next level of politics, warfare, and I think that made a lot of things
pragmatic, but we also have to keep in mind that especially in the 18th and 19th century, it became like a board game because, of course, it was effective at that time. For example, the British using rolling volley fire. But at the same time, you might think that, yeah, instead of meeting someone on the open field and just stand there and shoot at each other, why don't you take cover? Take cover and shoot from there. But it's mass fire. Soldiers can be replaced, okay? And, you just march at each other and start shooting and fighting. There are more secure ways to prevent your life and fight.
And that's when the rifles, the 95th rifles became, they were skirmishing rather than, and a lot of the British officers.
Yeah, of course they had.
95th rifles made famous by
also the Yeah. And they had to fight differently already during the French and Indian War over in North America, because they were doing more like skirmish fighting, not so much. They had open battles, of course, too, but you already had more hand-to-hand combat in the woods with the French and the Indian allies. You had more skirmishing. So when the English then later, like in the War of Independence, they used the Hessian riflemen, the Jäger, the hunters, to have skirmishers in the woods. So it was already there. So sharpshooting and skirmishing was always a part of warfare. Not only the big field battles, of course. Yeah.
And there was a lot of resistance about.
For example, in the time of the.
Sorry.
Yeah, and for example, in the time of Donald MacBain, during the Duke of Marlborough's campaigns around 1700, warfare was only few field battles which were famous, but most of it were sieges of fortresses and towns. So I think Donald MacBain had, I don't know how much battles he fought. He was in many major battles, but in his autobiography, you can read a lot about how often they stormed a fortress. So sieges were, during the time of Duke of Marlborough, the one thing you had to do much more than field battles. So
that continued in the Peninsula.
I think that is in Europe something that shifted already a bit,
So that the siege thing continued into the Peninsula Wars, the famous sieges of 1809, Badajoz and Talavera. All of those places.
Talavera.
Where they would just suddenly charge break through the walls. And you think, my God, the chosen men and all of that. Like, I want to get promotion, so I'll go through the siege. I'll go through the wall. Through the breach. That was it.
Just incredible. The weirdest thing is, having spent the last 3 years on the ships, like working, going around from port to port. Every port you get to, they'd be really excited. Oh, a new port. Let's look up on Google this. What happened here? Oh, the British had a fight here. Every single port. We were anchored off Trafalgar. There's an ocean bank, just 20 miles offshore there, and a lot of ships go and anchor there because you're outside of national waters. But you're close enough to get in if anything bad happens. And that. So we were anchored there off Trafalgar, and then we got a new route around North Southern America, up through the Caribbean to the United States. Went over, first port was Puerto Rico. From there, Puerto Rico, Cartagena, Dominican Republic, Honduras, Guatemala, Panama. Every single port you get to. It's like, Francis Drake came here with 30,000 men. But you're actually going in, and the entrances to the old harbours, they've actually got the Spanish fortresses there. So the majority of the harbours, as you're coming in, there's the old castle with the old cannon ports to keep the bloody British out, and then you go through that and then into the lagoons where they have the big modern ports. And it's quite an eye-opener, because you read it all in the books, and like you kind of know intellectually. And then every port you're going to, you're like, oh my God, no, they actually just built that entire great big castle to keep us out. And of course, the pilots are always rubbing it in.
But, you know,
Zane, one
Middle East,
question.
When I was in the Merchant Navy, you'd go to Iran and Iraq, which we often did, and you'd look at the architecture in places like Khorramshahr, and it was all like Victorian. You're like going, like Victorian architecture, amongst all of these other obviously indigenous style buildings, but there's like Victorian architecture. It's like, of course, yeah, because we were here. Wherever we went, we left our, we left our mark. You know, the Victorians were making a statement, weren't they?
Yeah, and in most places you go, it was a British victory, right?
Yeah.
Almost all the ports we're going to, it's like, oh yeah, the British turned up, kicked the crap out of us, and then either stayed for hundreds of years or took what they wanted and buggered off.
Yeah.
Like one of almost the only ports we went anywhere in the world where we'd fought, and they said they'd won, but that's doubtful. But it was Cartagena. But
Right.
But even Cartagena, we took the city and held it for, I think it was a week and a half or something. It wasn't very long, and then were forced to retreat. But everywhere you went, everyone was terrified that the British were going to come. They were absolutely terrified of the martial prowess of the British, and
yet that tradition.
Yeah. We've imported the Eastern fighting.
Yeah. So you sort of, do you still revisit judo and BJJ, or you're focusing mainly on wrestling?
No, I left all that.
Yeah.
Because for me, I wish I'd just done the wrestling from when I was a kid, because for me the mindset of wrestling is much better for the way that I learn. Right, so my way of learning is I much prefer just to do it,
and
then have somebody experience the point, that could be done a bit better if you do it a bit like this, rather than the more regimented way of learning. But I'm sure that for some people, the regimented learning is a much better way to do. But what I find with kids is that generally the kids are much better through non-regimented learning.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm not entirely sure if maybe we learn to try and learn in a regimented kind of way.
See, my kids love sparring, even when they're not skilled at it.
Yeah.
They just love to get in there, and that allows me to sort of pull them back and say, right, what you did there, you dropped your guard. That's why they kept hitting you. You know, so lift the, and it's like teaching them a little bit at a time, just drip feeding it, and because there's a practical application. Immediately they get an immediate response. You know, that didn't work, so I better do that, like my teacher says. They learn that much quicker, which is, why, it just makes sense to keep things as simple as possible.
What I wanted to ask, Zane, is when we compare traditional wrestling styles, we often see, you mentioned that there is mostly or even never ground fighting in most of the traditional wrestling styles, as far as I know. And very often we have, like in the back hold, of course, we have the back hold grip, which you cannot, which you cannot lose. You have to hold the back hold grip. So I think many traditional styles have a fixed grip, right? And what do you think in comparison to judo and freestyle wrestling, where this comes from compared to a loose hold fighting style of wrestling? Because many traditional styles have.
Tell you that straight away. If you have loose style, people, we're not allowed to say bad words, are we? Nearly said a bad word there.
That doesn't matter.
People mess around too much. Right? If you watch people starting in the judo, or it's one of the biggest problems with the freestyle wrestling and the Greco-Roman, right? All the freestyles, once you put a very high level of importance on winning, you end up with a 6-minute bout being 5 minutes of hand slapping, right? And then the majority of the fight, they haven't even taken a proper grip, and then the actual fast fight. Like the actual winning moves are done in a couple of seconds of the whole overall bout. Like, I mean, grip fighting in judo is one of the most important things. If you can get a dominant grip, then you're halfway won already, right? But if the other guy gets a better grip than you're in a bit of trouble, right? So you've got this tremendous thing about you want your dominance, and you even see it in back hold. to a degree. So like, if you go back, like these martial arts in European cultures were very, very different, right? Because it was more like the Mongol vision, right? So the Mongols had like the 3 pillars of manhood that every man had to be able to do. Every man had to be good at riding a horse. Every man had to be good at shooting a bow and arrow. Every man had to be good at wrestling, right? And unless you were proficient in those 3 things, then you couldn't call yourself a man. So whenever they had groupings for, you know, people coming together for big fairs, for markets, things like that, the men would always compete in these three subjects, right? And you had to be good at them all. And you see a very similar thing all the way around the world. Whatever that culture valued the most, men were expected to be good at it. In the Highlands in Scotland, men were expected to be tough because once the clans had started to form, so you had the first clans sort of forming around 1200, right? Once they're, you know, that sort of time, once you had the clans set up and you started to go into the period of clan warfare, it was, you know, it was normal. Once you left your lands, you were expecting to get jumped, right? So you had to have a good base of martial skill, but that wasn't your job. You weren't a professional soldier. You didn't make money out of fighting. You stayed alive by fighting, right? You still had to be a good herdsman in order to raise your beef so that your cows weren't dying. You also had to be a good sailor on the West Coast anyway, because if you're going around the islands, like, and that's why, like, I think it was something quite shocking that, like, at Trafalgar, something like 30% of the sailors are believed to have been Scottish. And the reason for that is that after the Act of Union and that, there were so many people from the west coast of Scotland who were highly proficient sailors. But that wasn't all they did. You couldn't just be a sailor. You had to be a farmer. You had to be a sailor. You had to be a soldier. You had to be everything. So you had, nowadays we use the term jack of all trades, master of none, but we use it as an insult. But before, like, it was considered the highest thing, was to be a jack of all trades, right? You didn't need to be a master of anything, but you needed to be good at everything. One of the most successful animals on this planet is the rat, right? But the rat's not the smartest, not the fastest, not the best swimmer, but it can swim, right? It's not the best fighter, but it can fight, right? It's not the most intelligent, but it can think, right? So what we kind of imagine for ourselves, we have a very strange view now towards combat and martial arts, and everybody wants to be like the indestructible Rambo, and that was never an ideal back in the old days, right? Nobody expected to go onto the battlefield and be this absolute killing machine rolling down the highway of death, right? Everybody knew it was going to be brutal, bloody. You had to just be able to do your best, right? So in the Highlands, when everyone was coming together, they wanted to test each other's manhood, right? But it's a tremendously violent culture. And if you hurt somebody else from another clan, they're not going to take that nicely, right? So if you imagine something where you're punching and kicking, right? People are going to get hurt and people are going to get upset. There's going to be blood, right? And there's a hilarious wrestling match, like where this one guy smashes this guy's nose. There's blood everywhere, right? And the guy's mum sees that there's blood all over his face. She can't help herself. She just runs straight on the mat and she's hitting this wrestler with her handbag, right? And everyone's just dying, right? But that's a natural event. If you see somebody you're close to have an obvious sign of distress, right, then you're much more likely to jump in, right? So they needed a form of combat that was going to allow you to fight in a very hard physical manner, but was unlikely to produce injuries that were going to lead to revenge attacks. They also had a lot of men, right? So you think, you know, like at a big gathering, there could be a couple of thousand men there, right? And all of those men are going to want to, in some way, test their manhood, right? So you've got a day or two. So whatever you're doing has to be very, very quick. Like if you look at like the Olympics in judo or wrestling, right? One division might be 14 men, right? And it's still going to take all day, right? So in answer to why is it close gripped, is they needed the bouts to be as fast as possible, right? They needed them to be absolutely as fast as possible so that you can get through everybody on the same day, right? So we don't want people messing about trying to get a good grip. No, stop messing about, take your grip. Each fight will be 30 seconds, right? And we'll know we'll get through everybody in the day. And the backhold grip also has this immense advantage. And that's that once you've got your hands around somebody, you have to let go of your grip in order to punch them, right? So if you lose your temper in a backhold wrestling bout, you have to let go, disengage, and then come back, right? Yeah. And that means the referees that are stood there have got plenty of time to clock you with their stick. And you see this in Scotland, they've got the sticks. You see it all the way out into Russia, where they've got the referees have got the big sticks. And that's what they did in the old days. And that's why the rule is if you break the grip, right, the match is over. That rule's not there. There's no martial reason for that, right? The reason for that is purely psychological, because if you break that grip, they're like, oh, we think he's lost it. He's going to do a Mike Tyson, try and bite somebody's ear off. Just clock him, right? You lost, let go of your grip, get out of here. You know, and they've got no comeback then because, you know, you let go of your grip, so bye. But it was never expected that you maintain the grip or even have a full grip in an actual fight. Yeah. So it's like if you were actually fighting, it would be more rare that you would take the backhold grip. But it does crop up surprisingly often. Like I had one big fight on the ship against a Ukrainian lad, and that ended up in the backhold grip. And that's actually what gave me the advantage of it, and I came out on top, was because he was trying to take the grip. He was a decent wrestler, but actually me getting my arms locked meant that I could get him to the edge of the ship, like, and yeah. So it does.
I think that's maybe a natural thing that humans have the tendency, if they come into the fight, they want to keep the distance. Or on the other way around, they want to enclose. So you try to, it's like, you know, fight or flight. So you keep the distance or you close the distance. So I think in a real fight, not many people want to stand in front of each other and trade punches or you know, toe to toe, but they want to, you know, slow down the fight, avoid punches, come close and want to grab the other guy to get control of him. Or they want to keep the distance and go like, whoa, okay, and maybe, you know, use a push kick to keep the other one at bay, don't come close to me. So I think that's also maybe a natural thing why this is a good position to be, the closest you can be in backhold wrestling, because you cannot go any closer. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you say that.
Yeah, even in Muay Thai, they've got clinch work.
It's funny you say that, but like,
right.
You can actually be a long way away from each other in backhold, and that's one of the skills. See, I was really I didn't want to do backhold. Like I'd heard of it about a long time before I actually started doing it, right? But I always thought it'd be really boring, right? Because I always thought it would be very static. I thought it would just be, you're just going to trip somebody over, and there's not going to be a whole lot of things you can go into it. I think it's incredibly technical, and in a lot of ways, right? So being close to somebody isn't enough. Right? If you want to get a big throw on somebody, right, you need to have them upright, right? And you need to have your hips to their hips, your shoulders to their shoulders, right? So what happens in backhold is I have to take this grip, but I can stand right back with my shoulder, with my hips, and I can bend right over so that I'm stood there like that, right? I'm actually stood a long way away from you. And one of the biggest problems then is you have to find a way, if you want to do a big throw on me, you have to find a way of pulling me in and straightening me up. And with a backhold grip, if I get my back as flat as I can, some people can get it almost 90 degrees. And then you've got your hands sat on top of them, right? And trying to pull them up is an absolute nightmare. Mm-hmm. And the thing with the backhold, like in all the traditional wrestlings, almost none of them have weight classes. So now some of the competitions have a few weight classes that they've put in, which has come from other martial arts. But originally, traditional wrestling, it's just man against man. And one of the things that's very good about backhold is it's very good for teaching smaller people to fight against larger opponents, because you don't have anywhere to hide, right? You can't run away. You have to stand and fight. And one of the techniques is that if you're smaller than somebody, if you feel bigger and stronger than somebody with a fixed backhold grip, then you want to get them chest to chest, get them stood upright, and that's it. They're going right over, right? But if you're smaller, you want to get your back bent right over. And you see some incredible fights when you get small, skilled people going up against bigger people. Like there's a wrestler, Rab from up Glasgow, and he's absolutely infamous. They're still terrified of him all around the Lake District, you know, because he's like 14 stone, and he won the World Heavyweight Championship by suplexing a 22 stone guy. You know,
I thought there'd be weight divisions.
There kind of are now, but it's something that's been.
But traditionally, there's not.
Traditionally, there's not. No,
so
traditionally, there's only open weight, and they all have the biggest championship still. Even now, when they've introduced weight competitions, so there's things for the smaller people, but the biggest championship is the open weight, and the most skilled little people. When you see a really skilled little person fighting in the open weight, it is truly incredible. I mean, that's where legends are born.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But the other thing that really surprised me as well is how dynamic it is. It's actually you see far more big throws in the back hold than you do in the judo, right? Which really, really surprised me, right? Because I thought the back hold was going to be really static, and it's not. You're constantly moving, right? So you've got a good bout with two good people is very quick. The people are moving around because you have an uneven grip, right? You've got an underhook and an overhook, right? So one side you can push really strong and one side you can't, right? And it's both on opposite sides. You've got your strength. So the two of you end up spinning round. When you're pushing and pulling and pushing and pulling, you often get a situation where the two people are spinning around, and this generates centrifugal force. And then suddenly, when one person gets a big throw on another, you're literally there's a throw called the swinging hype, and it's really interesting because it's actually attacked the old Coleman. The old Coleman used to use it. It's like standard weight for old cold coal sat was 50 kilos, right? And you see a lot of the Colemen were really small guys, man, right? And so they lifted the coal bags with technique. And it's actually quite a long way to take a 50 kilo coal bag from the ground up onto your shoulder.
Yeah.
And they use the knee, lift it with hands and knee, and swing it round up onto the top. You have the same throw, the swinging hype, in the traditional wrestling. And when you see two wrestlers who've built momentum by spinning, lift and throw, I think they're genuinely the biggest throws I've ever seen.
I saw something with Northumberland and Cumberland wrestling when I was when I was a teenager. I was up in Northumberland, and there was a country fair.
Alone.
And they were brilliant. They're all in like long johns and stuff, and they looked skinny. This guy, there's like a really skinny guy against quite a stocky guy, and I remember exactly because I was laughing when you were saying they were spinning, because these guys just kept going round and round and round and round. And it was like, obviously there were some old boys there who were like real experts at this, and I hadn't got a clue what I was watching. I think I was about 16. I've been doing karate for years, you know. I'm watching, I'm thinking, what is going on here? And he kept going, and he just flicked him up, and this guy crashed to the ground. Everybody's like clapping, and I'm like, whoa, how did that skinny bloke throw that big bloke? Yeah. And Cumberland wrestling is backhold wrestling, isn't it?
Yeah, it's basically the same sport.
What about the long johns? Are the long johns important?
No, they were, unsurprisingly, the sport, something went on with the Cumberland wrestling, and it actually started to enjoy nationwide support. it became really big in the 1800s, and there was a big society down
Oh,
in
it wasn't that long ago.
Do you remember?
No, I don't remember. I'm not that old.
No, but
That's why you find a lot of literature about Cumberland, Westmoreland, backhold wrestling from the 19th century. Yeah.
And if you look at the pants on the outside, that was the standard gymnasium dress.
Yeah, the pants on the outside.
Late 1800s. So they stuck that. And if you actually see the traditional ones, some of the traditional pants are absolutely beautiful, because they would traditionally, their mums would embroider countryside symbols.
Yeah.
So like I've even seen ones with badgers on.
Yeah. Well, the Cornish wrestlers have those jackets, don't they? Is that jacket wrestling? That's a different thing, isn't it? Is that jacket wrestling or something?
There are basically two types of Celtic wrestling that have survived.
Right.
There's the Cumberland, Westmoreland, Highland wrestling, which are basically the same thing.
Okay.
And there was a form of that was done in Northern Ireland, not as in Northern Ireland, as in the north of the island.
Yeah.
So it was done in Donegal and in the 6 counties and that. But apparently that only died out about 1980. So, we were all still alive when it was still going, but that's been died out for a number of years now.
Yeah, it's quite sad that all of these arts that we're talking about now are really just vanishing, really, because of things like the Oriental martial arts, Krav Maga, self-protection, and it's like, we had all this stuff back in the time of George Silver. I mean, George Silver was amazing, some of the stuff he was saying.
Yeah.
But
the sad thing is I don't think they're disappearing because of that. Right?
No.
I don't think it's not that's made them disappear. Because if you look at the number of martial arts that our communities seem to be able to sustain, it seems to be unbelievable. I mean, like, there are actually more people in Scotland who do that Vietnamese martial art.
Oh, yeah.
And, there are more of them in Scotland than there are backhold wrestlers. I mean, the backhold wrestling is literally at a point now where in Scotland, it's very close to going.
And the games are not keeping
There's less than 20 people left.
And the Highland Games are not sort of keeping it alive?
No, the Highland Games are very, very, very keen to have it. Right?
Yeah.
But the problem is you have to have the clubs to feed the Highland Games. So the Highland Games, they're a spectacle and they pay you to come, right? So they'll say, okay, this is our Highland Games. We want to have cable tossing, strength events, wrestling. We'll have this running. We'll have this cycling, right? And there's 10 grand to do the heavy sports. There's 2 grand to do the wrestling. There's 3 grand to do the running, right? But they don't do any organization for the rest of the year. So it's down to the system of clubs that used to feed in. So like you'll turn up at the Highland Games and that's just a competition. So you turn up on the morning, you sign in and then you wrestle on the day, get your prize money and go home. Yeah. Right? So their only input was ever on that day, right? Now, for some reason, it's very difficult to get people involved in the traditional arts, right? And I really don't understand why, because they've got a tremendous amount to give, right? And funny enough, one of the judo coaches I had, who taught me so much and took me from being very average to being, watch yourself. He actually taught me in judo tricks from traditional wrestling, right? So he was a traditional wrestler and he had actually learned techniques for breaking balance from the sport Glima from Iceland, which comes in with all the Celtic wrestling. Because basically you've got the history of the west coast of Scotland. It's not even the west coast of Scotland, it's the history of all the British Isles, right? So you had the Celts, Saxons, and the Vikings, right? Now the Vikings came in, they attacked the west coast and the east coast a lot, but the Saxons were far more numerous and they were tough, right? So because you had lots of people like Northumbria, first place to be attacked was Northumbria, and that was up at Lindisfarne. But Northumbria, they were ravaging and buggering off. But just a year or two later, they turned up on the other side of the country at Iona, and they burnt the monastery at Iona. Difference there was they didn't go home, right? There was enough room that they didn't have to go home, right? So they burnt Iona, and instead of going back to Norway, they went to one of the other islands and they just sat there because there was nobody there and there was no army that was going to suddenly appear and drive them off. And from that moment, you got the beginning of the setting up of this huge Viking Empire that is largely forgotten today. Like almost every major city in Ireland was founded by the Vikings.
Yeah.
Cumbria, all the coast around there was heavily settled by the Vikings. The Isle of Man became the centre of their kingdom. All the west coast of Scotland, islands, and some of the mainland fell into their domain. But also all the west part of England, like around here, Fleetwood, Blackpool, Wyre Peninsula, all the way down to Liverpool, fell under their domain as well. And strangely, very little happened in Wales. There was very, very little Viking ingress into the Welsh communities, like Anglesey, notable example, the only island in the North Sea that they didn't take. And something very, very interesting happened there in the relationship between the Welsh and the Vikings.
Do you think there was a pact?
Well, I think it's going to come down to something to do with religion. You see, it's very suspicious that Anglesey, it was attacked a bit, but then after the initial raiding phases, they seem to have stopped and left it. And Anglesey was the Holy Island, right? It was the Holy Island for the pre-Christian Celts.
Right.
When the Celts turned to the Celtic Church, which was a very different church to what we think of as Christianity today, the Celtic Church, again, Anglesey was a holy island. And everyone's very familiar with the Irish saints that came over to Scotland, St. Columbia and that to convert the heathens. But Christianity actually went from Wales to Ireland. So in Ireland, like St. Patrick's Welsh, and he was captured by the Irish as a slave, taken to Ireland, escaped, came back to Wales, then went back to Ireland to convert the heathens to Christianity. So it's probably likely that Anglesey became a holy island for the Celtic Church. Yeah. And as the Vikings, as their society merged with the Gaelic society in Ireland and on the Western Isles, it's likely that they came to have a lot of respect for it. But it's really interesting as well, because that's again the fault line where you have between the two different styles of wrestling. So the northern part seems to be the backhold, and then the southern Welsh parts are where you've got the jacket style wrestling. So yeah, so there's a lot of really, really interesting history there.
Well, I just want to say, so at this point, Zane, this is we've done over an hour now. Okay. No, I don't want to interrupt you. And I made some notes here. I'd like to continue this. I think Heiko would like to get involved. I don't know. But I'm quite
always
going deeper into this. Now that we've found out about this division. That's absolutely fascinating, Zane. Honestly, mate, I'll sit and listen to this all day. But sadly, most people who listen to podcasts listen for about an hour and then they switch off.
Okay.
So would you be happy to do like part 2 where we pick up the threads of what you're talking about, the history of the development of jacket wrestling and the Highland wrestling?
Yeah, no problem.
Is that all right? That's great. I mean, Heiko, have you got anything to say, mate? Because you're like a co-host, really, aren't you?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. I just wanted to say that what I find also fascinating about the backhold wrestling, the traditional wrestling, is the connection to swordsmanship, because we find some of the techniques used in backhold wrestling under the same name in broadsword manuals. So most famously the back heel. And because we were talking about the fixed grip, and Zane and we already talked about this also a lot, about the origin of the fixed grip, and that of course when you do swordsmanship or any kind of weapon, as soon as you come to an enclose and commanding technique, you have to get hold of the weapon arm or the weapon hand or the weapon itself of your opponent. At the same time, you have your own weapon in your hand. And what happens then is that your lower extremities are getting much more involved. So we have a lot of these knee pushs and tripping and back heel techniques with your legs, also in swordsmanship. As soon as you get hold of the weapon hand of your opponent, and you are not able yet to use your weapon, or maybe you don't want to kill or injure him, just to throw him down and fix him and arrest him or whatnot. Or maybe you have momentum. So we have a lot of these details about using, for example, your knee to push your own knee in the knee of your opponent to trip him, and that is quite something you also do in backhold wrestling, as far as I learned so far from Zane.
So
this is what fascinates me: the connection, the historical connection.
Well, they were part of the same system. So if you imagine, like, you're living in a society where part of your role in that society is to be the defender. So you have to have a proficient level as a warrior. So you start with children. So you've got children, they naturally start wrestling, but they're children. You're not gonna put a sword in their hand and start them sword fighting, right? So you give them a stick, but you start off first with the wrestling.
Yeah.
Right. So with very, very young children, I mean, you can start children backhold wrestling at 6, 7 years old. Right. And then by the time they're 12, 13, they're really pretty proficient.
Yeah.
And then you stick a stick in their hand. And that's also, like I was saying, that's part of the philosophy behind the fixed grip, is because if you haven't got the fixed grip, why are you wrestling? Right, you're in a society where there is no lack of sharp, pointy things. So if you don't have a fixed grip, if your hands are free, why are you not stabbing the guy to death?
Well, we'll come back to all of those links, I think, the next time, because I think that's another subject in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's been, I mean, as always, I always enjoy doing these podcasts, and I always learn something, even from you, Zane. and we need, Heiko, we need to force this man to write a book.
Oh yes.
Find me someone who can draw. I can
draw.
Can you?
Yeah, of course.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
We just need the illustrations, because your problem is like photos just look so crap.
Oh yeah, I agree. And the drawings give it that oldie worldy feel, don't they?
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? Like a proper manual.
Yeah.
And then you'll have to do a German translation of it, Heiko. And
yeah,
I'll do a Geordie translation of it. Right. Well, look, I'm going to say goodbye and close the podcast. But don't go away, because I'll still be on the air, if you know what I mean. So thanks, Heiko, again for helping me with this, co-hosting it. And Zane,
yeah, my pleasure.
It's been brilliant. All right. Go back to sea.